So I first met Nelson Mandela in 1992 when I was the Member of Parliament for Houghton, and he moved into my area 2 years after his release from prison, and he invited me and the then leader of the Democratic Party to his house for dinner. And it was a very agreeable, interesting, and engaged evening because we were able to talk about things, and he was very charming, very relaxed, and very engaged.
My relationship with former President Nelson Mandela, Uncle Nelson as I used to call him, goes back directly to my parents, who knew him since the 1940s and 50s. I was born in 1956, so I was born into the relatively early years of their budding relationship, political, social, and in terms of friendship.
You know, I've never formally met President Nelson Mandela. I never got a chance to do that. Obviously, as a proud Sowetan, we knew of Nelson Mandela. When he got released, the rally, the events, we watched and we were part of it. But the first time, actually, sadly, was when I saw Nelson Mandela. I went to go see his body lying in state. And it was a memory for me as a South African that made me realize here lay an ordinary human being who dared do an extraordinary thing. And that memory is something that I will cherish for as long as I live, because it made me realize that it is within all of us to pursue being great in whatever context we find ourselves, whether in our home, whether in our communities, whether in our businesses, but pursue it.
Mandela was a contradiction. He was a combination of this. He had an extraordinary range of attitudes and emotions. In the post-democratic phase, or when South Africa had become a democracy, and Mandela and I had a lot of engagements as a leader of an opposition party to his party, I saw another side of Mandela. He was a person who was extraordinarily keen to engage people who didn't agree with him. And I guess you could say I was a person who did not agree with quite a lot of Mandela's policies in the 94 to 99 period when he was president, because I didn't think they were liberal and I was the head of a liberal party. But of course, many aspects of his policies were. And he would be very keen, almost the further away you were from him ideologically, to bring you closer.
When Madiba was a member of the Youth Congress, he was actively opposed to the influence of other races and the like. And he opposed my father, who was then Secretary of the Indian Congress. There's a famous occurrence when he pulled my father off a stage from speaking. But they got to know each other in spite of that through a number of people. Ismail Mir, J.N. Singh, Walter Sisulu. These are the people who shaped Mandela's mind and understood and made him understand, if you like, that the world is bigger than the aspirations of one group, that people are made up of individuals, as we liberals believe, and we need to infuse that into society. So then my father got close to Mandela politically, and of course my mother, who was married to him at that time, was a young beautiful woman. And as we know, Madiba loved young beautiful women, so he was very drawn to my father, who was his friend, and my father's beautiful wife, and they became great friends. There was an occasion when my mother was 21, when Madiba and my father cooked a meal of 21 pigeons for them. My father in the kitchen with Madiba, and my mother said they cooked a very bad meal, but it was a nice occasion.
You know, there are multiple Nelson Mandelas in many ways. There's the Nelson Mandela you can recall from looking at history, his treason trial speech, which to me in there, we know the famous line that you oppose a domination of one race by another. But I think we forget that here was Nelson Mandela who was willing to die for his convictions. And for me as a leader, I've always maintained that you don't have a lot of things, but the one thing you should always have and the one thing you should always defend are your convictions. In a political climate, you can be tempted to go with the wind, so to say, but your convictions remain such.
In January 1997, I received a phone call from Mandela's secretary say the president would like to meet you for breakfast. Mandela, habits of a lifetime in prison, got up very early in the morning. I was then in my 30s. I preferred a later start to the day, but he was the president, I wasn't. So I presented myself at his Houghton home at 6 a.m. for a breakfast session. And he said to me, Tony, I'd like you to join the government. And so I asked Mandela, I think, what was the key question. I said to him, Mr. President, and when we go outside cabinet, how do I express myself? And he then said to me something which I think made the deal, as it subsequently proved, not possible. He said, you know, Tony, we must face the world with one face. And then he added, just like Mugabe and Nkomo are doing in Zimbabwe. Well, of course, Joshua Nkomo was the leader of the ZAPU party, which was co-opted into the ZANU government of Robert Mugabe. And that was the end for a long period of time of any effective opposition in Zimbabwe. So I thought about that, and then it subsequently became clear that that was an unachievable objective, that you couldn't simultaneously be a government and an opposition at the same time. And of course, Mandela stood down in 1999, and the Democratic Party was vindicated in its approach when it leapfrogged the then official opposition, the National Party, and became the largest opposition party in that election.
You know, my values I owe entirely to my history, to the history of my mother, my father, and people like Madiba. These are very strong values. They are values which, and it might seem trite that I repeat this, but they are values that are bound, that are solidified and expressed through the development of freedom, through the development of fairness and access of opportunity. Those are the foundational values which I talk about today as a member of the Democratic Alliance, as a liberal. But in reality, they go back a long way. They go through my blood into the DNA that reaches far back through my parents, through Madiba, through my grandparents, into the values which form me.
All he wanted was equality, not a supremacy of one race. The ideals that actually black South Africans who were living under apartheid could be the kind of people who were equal to white South Africans. Not better, just equal. And I think that is an incredibly powerful ideal, which is something that I have taken and wanted to fight for, because I believe it's crucial for South Africa. But furthermore, I think if you look at the Nelson Mandela who said, this thing, we're not getting peaceful negotiations, and therefore we must take a much tougher stance. What are you willing to lay down your life for?
I would say the primary example that he gave was a generosity of spirit, that he was generous, particularly on symbolic matters, particularly on nation-building matters, but he was unyielding on matters of core principle. And so I realized that it was very important that you give way on matters of status, matters of, if you like, social positioning, but you should never, ever surrender your bottom lines. And that perhaps was the story of Mandela, that in the most fraught of circumstances, beyond my imagining or experience or most other people's, he was unerring in sticking to his bottom lines and his principles.
So in terms of what may have shook Madiba is why I have changed from the ANC blood which which ran in my veins to join the DA. I think in a way Madiba would have understood, although he was dyed in the blood, in his soul, ANC, he would have understood that there is a time for liberation movements to bring a society to a particular point. And then there is a time for people to run with it, with their own aspirations, with their own individual aspirations, with the views of what society should hold, where it should take us, and that is not necessarily tied to the past. It's tied to the future. He would have understood that. I understand that. I think my parents would have understood that. And that's my challenge and the challenge of our country.
I think that Mandela would, if I might speculate, which is what you've asked me to do, give a message to South Africa that you've got to keep the democratic promise of this country. We're seeing a very energetic excavation under the constitutional settlement that Nelson Mandela had championed. So whether Mandela would express it publicly or there'd be some private regrets, if he was true to the person he was, the statesman he became, after his release in 1990, he would probably have something to say about that. And it might be of comfort to those who say, we can't abandon the non-racial nature of our project. We can't simply give up key pillars of our constitutional democracy because the expedience of the moment demands that we do so, or the excitations of our electorate suggest that we should.
In his very calm way, he would say, Aibo, what's going on here is not good. He would say that for more than 25 years, he sacrificed, and many people before him, everything for us to get freedom. Almost 25 years ago, we won that freedom. He would ask, what have you done with that freedom? What have you made tangible for our people to benefit in terms of that freedom? What opportunities have you put on the table? How have you given it to the broad masses instead of to a select few? And he would shake his head and say, that's not good.
We'll reflect on 100 years of Nelson Mandela. The powerful image of a uniter, someone who, coming out of a 27-year imprisonment, was able to create the space to free, as President Obama once said, not only the oppressed, but the oppressor. Not only the free, but the jailer. In this 100th-year centenary, I think we have to take a hard look at saying, have we lived up to those values? But beyond that, my argument is this, is that there's never been a greater time for those values to be contested for. All over the world, we're seeing populists who are rising up, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Latin America, in different parts of the globe. And they give to the world values of division, they give to the world statements that isolate people. We must build a strategy for everybody's success. And therefore, in the centenary of Nelson Mandela, how many more Nelson Mandelas will rise up in the world and stand up to the populist bullies so that, in fact, we can project a future for all the people? That, to me, is why the cause that we're engaged with becomes vital. Because if we are not careful to it, the world will find ourselves in history repeating itself, nation rising against nation. We have to build a strategy for success.